5 days. That is the gap. 5 days between the moment Donald Trump boarded Air Force One and left Beijing, and the moment Vladimir Putin walked down the red carpet at the Great Hall of the People and shook Xi Jinping's hand in front of the same cameras, in the same city, at the same table where Trump had been sitting less than a week ago. 5 days. Think about what that image communicates to every government on Earth watching it. Think about what it communicates to every intelligence analyst in Washington who is trying to understand the new architecture of global power. Think about what it communicates to every leader in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe who is trying to figure out where the center of gravity in the 21st century world actually is. Because what happened in Beijing this week is not a diplomatic coincidence. It is not a scheduling convenience. It is not simply two routine state visits that happen to fall close together on a calendar. What happened in Beijing this week is one of the most carefully constructed displays of strategic positioning in modern diplomatic history. And the message it sends is so clear, so unmistakable, so precisely targeted at the foundations of American global dominance that I am genuinely surprised more people are talking about it tonight. Xi Jinping just received the leaders of both superpowers within 5 days of each other. The leader of the Western world came first, the leader of the Eastern Alliance came second, and Xi sat at the center of both conversations, holding leverage over both men, needed by both sides, beholden to neither. Let me explain why this moment is more significant than almost anything else that has happened in global geopolitics this year. Trump went to Beijing needing something. We have already established this. He needed China to pressure Iran into accepting a deal that would let him end a war that has cost America $29 billion in 75 days. He needed Xi's diplomatic influence over Tehran to give him the off-ramp that American military power alone has not been able to create. He went to Beijing, in other words, as a supplicant, dressed in the language of partnership and mutual interest, but structurally, functionally, in the position of a man who needs something from someone who has not yet decided to give it. The two sides disagreed about what they even agreed on. Washington touted trade wins. Beijing warned against overstepping on Taiwan and stated the war on Iran should never have started. Two completely different narratives from the same meeting, which means the gap between what Trump needed and what he actually got was large enough that both sides could not even agree on a common description of the outcome. Al Jazeera. And then 5 days later, Putin arrived. The quick succession of Trump's and Putin's visits highlighted Beijing's growing role as an international superpower, experts say. That is the polite diplomatic language that analysts use when they want to describe something extraordinary without appearing to celebrate it. Let me use less polite language. What just happened in Beijing is that Xi Jinping demonstrated, in the most visible way possible, that China is now the indispensable nation. The nation that both Washington and Moscow need. The nation that both the American-led West and the Russian-aligned East must court. The nation that sits at the center of every conversation that matters. NPR Xi and Putin signaled a deepening partnership and warned against a global return to the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle. That phrase is not accidental. That phrase is a direct message to Washington. It is a characterization of American foreign policy, of the war in Iran, of the unilateral use of military force without UN authorization, of the sanctions regime, of the dollar weaponization, of the entire architecture of American global dominance as something primitive, something illegitimate, something that the rest of the world is now organizing to resist. Al Jazeera Xi described the current global environment as complex and unstable, and urged both countries to work together to create a fairer and more equal system of global governance. Language that analysts widely interpreted as a direct challenge to Western-led international structures. A fairer and more equal system. In the diplomatic language that Beijing uses, those words mean one thing very specifically: a system in which America does not make the rules unilaterally. A system in which the dollar is not the automatic foundation of global trade. A system in which military force cannot be deployed at will without consequence. A system, in other words, that looks nothing like the one America has presided over since 1945. Daily Pakistan. And now look at what Putin brought to Beijing and why it matters so much in this specific moment. Putin noted that Moscow and Beijing had reached a very substantial step forward in cooperation in the oil and gas sector, saying practically all the key issues have been agreed upon. Oil and gas. Energy. The same resource that flows through the Strait of Hormuz. The same resource that Iran is using as leverage against America. The same resource that is currently priced at over $100 a barrel because of the war that America started. At the exact moment when the global energy system is under maximum stress because of American military action in the Gulf, Russia and China are quietly finalizing the architecture of an alternative energy trading relationship that operates entirely outside American control. NPR. Russia has been redirecting crude oil exports away from European markets toward China and India since 2022. The Hormuz crisis has pushed Brent crude to $109 to $110 per barrel and has simultaneously increased the value of Russia's non-Hormuz energy trade routes, making Russian crude delivered via pipeline and northern shipping lanes entirely outside the Gulf even more strategically valuable. Business upturn. Read that sentence again carefully. The war that America started to control Middle Eastern energy and protect the petrodollar has made Russian energy more valuable, strengthened the China-Russia energy relationship, increased the incentive for major Asian economies to develop non-dollar energy trading mechanisms, and pushed the global energy market in exactly the opposite direction from the one American strategy intended to push it. This is the trap. Not just the military trap in Hormuz, the strategic trap. The one that China and Russia have been quietly constructing for years, and that the Iran war has now snapped shut around American foreign policy with a finality that Washington is only beginning to fully process. Because think about what Beijing has just demonstrated this week. Trump came to ask Xi to help end a war. Xi offered sympathy and vague diplomatic gestures. China did not give Trump what he wanted, an end to the Iran war. Moscow will be content that Beijing is not going to abandon Tehran or Moscow. And then 5 days later, Putin arrived, and the two countries signed 40 agreements covering energy, trade, education, and security, deepening a partnership that Washington has spent 3 years trying to prevent from consolidating. Al Jazeera America tried to break the China-Russia-Iran triangle by taking out the weakest link, by hitting Iran hard and fast, forcing a quick capitulation, demonstrating that the Axis could not survive American military pressure, and watching the triangle collapse from within. That was the theory behind Operation Epic Fury. That was the strategic logic that Netanyahu sold to Trump in February. The triangle did not collapse. It hardened. Iran absorbed the strikes. Iran closed the strait. Iran refused American peace terms that it characterized as surrender. China provided diplomatic cover, orbital intelligence support, and economic relationships that kept Iranian oil flowing. Russia provided strategic solidarity, weapons technology, and the model of how a sanctioned power survives American economic pressure while continuing to pursue its objectives. And now, today in Beijing, with Trump barely off the plane, China and Russia are sitting together and finalizing the architecture of a world that does not need American permission to function. Putin praised Xi as dear friend, while Xi described their ties as unshakable. Yet observers noted a striking contrast in tone. Russia speaks with urgency and enthusiasm, while China communicates with calculated restraint and strategic confidence. That contrast is important, because it tells you exactly who holds power in this relationship. Russia needs China. China does not need Russia in the same way. Russia is the junior partner, dependent on Chinese markets for its energy revenues, dependent on Chinese diplomatic cover for its international position, dependent on Chinese technology for industries that Western sanctions have cut off. China is the senior partner, choosing how much of its leverage to deploy and when, maintaining flexibility, keeping options open, never committing more than necessary. Daily Pakistan. As one analyst put it, China holds all the cards. Rather, as Trump went cap in hand to Beijing, so will Putin. China has all the cards. Al Jazeera. China has all the cards. Let that sink in for a moment. Not Russia, not America, China. The country that has not fired a single shot in the Iran war. The country that has not deployed a single soldier anywhere in the Middle East. The country that has not made a single dramatic military gesture or threatening speech. China, which has simply built, invested, traded, connected, and waited, now holds more leverage over the outcome of the most important geopolitical conflict of the decade than either of the two nations actually fighting it. This is what a 20-year strategy looks like when it matures. This is what patient, systematic, non-military power accumulation produces when it reaches its moment of activation. This is what Chinese strategists meant when they talked about building a new type of great power relationship. Not confronting American power directly, not challenging it on the battlefield where America is strongest, but surrounding it, undermining its foundations, building alternatives to every system it depends on, and waiting for the moment when the weight of American overextension does what no enemy could do from the outside. Now look at what happens next, and why the Beijing week changes the calculations in every remaining element of this conflict. Trump is returning from Beijing without the deal he needed. Iran is still refusing American terms. The ceasefire is on life support. Oil prices are at $110 and threatening to go higher. Inside the White House, aides say Trump is now more seriously considering resuming combat operations against Iran. But resuming bombing means Iranian retaliation against Gulf Arab infrastructure. Gulf Arab states are warning Washington privately that they cannot absorb another round of Iranian strikes on their energy facilities. And every day the war continues is another day that Russia's pipeline energy becomes more valuable, that China's alternative financial infrastructure looks more attractive to the governments trying to diversify away from dollar dependency, and that the demonstration effect of American strategic failure in Iran spreads to every government in the world that is watching and calculating. Axios, the Beijing week, did not create this situation, but it crystallized it. It made visible something that has been developing for years: the emergence of an alternative center of gravity in global politics. A center that does not announce itself with military force. A center that operates through economic relationships, energy deals, diplomatic positioning, and the patient accumulation of leverage until the moment arrives when that leverage can be exercised decisively. Xi called the Middle East situation a critical turning point and said the region is entering a transition from war to peace, but warned that any renewed outbreak of conflict would be unacceptable. Xi is telling Trump something with that language, not asking, not requesting, telling. A renewed outbreak of conflict in the Middle East would be unacceptable to Beijing. And Beijing, which holds Russian energy revenues, Iranian oil trade, and the diplomatic credibility that Washington spent this week desperately seeking, has the leverage to make that statement mean something. Daily Pakistan. In 5 days, Xi Jinping met the leader of the West and the leader of the East. He gave both of them something. He gave neither of them everything they needed. He emerged from both meetings with more leverage than he entered them with, and he did it all without leaving Beijing, without deploying a single military asset, without making a single threat. This is what the transition of global power looks like in the 21st century. Not a battle, not a declaration, not a dramatic moment that everyone can point to and say, that is when it changed. Just 2 state visits, 5 days apart, in the same city, at the same table, with the same man sitting at the center, and the world watching and beginning to understand what that means.